It was the sound that stopped me. Not a scream. Not a shout. Just that soft, brutal sound a boarding pass makes when it's torn, not by mistake, but by quiet intention. I'd lived through wars, riots, and recessions. I've lost a husband, buried 2 brothers, and outlived nearly everyone from my high school graduating class. But somehow, what unsettled me most that morning wasn't death or memory, it was the way a woman like her was made to stand still while the world kept walking around her. The airport was calm, unnaturally so. At 72, I've grown suspicious of quiet places. They often mean something's being ignored. My name is Evelyn Rose, and I was seated in 4C on Flight 749 to San Diego, just behind the thin blue curtain that separated first class from the rest of us. I was flying out to visit my youngest granddaughter, who had just given birth to a baby girl. It was supposed to be a joyful trip. I had even brought along a crocheted blanket I'd started before the baby was born, white and peach, stitched with hope and sore knuckles. But the trip changed before it even began. And not because of turbulence. Not because of the weather. It changed because of her. The woman in the gray pantsuit. Calm. Elegant. Entirely alone. I remember thinking she looked like someone important, though not the kind of importance that demands attention. No, hers was a quiet authority, like a woman who had once made hard decisions for a living and had learned how to carry the weight of them well. She was next to me in the boarding line, just a few passengers ahead. She stood with her back straight, her heels just barely clicking against the textured jet bridge floor. Her boarding pass was in her left hand, her right gently resting on the handle of a modest leather bag. She was not flashy. She was not loud. But every movement of hers whispered, "I belong here." That's what made what happened next so jarring. The gate agent, a woman in a sharply pressed navy uniform named Loretta, scanned the woman's ticket, then paused. Her smile flickered. Something in her body language shifted, just slightly, but I noticed. I always notice small things. My late husband used to say I could read a room faster than the thermostat could. Loretta didn't hand the boarding pass back. Instead, she asked the woman, her name, I would later learn, was Serena Cole, to step aside for just a moment. No explanation. No apology. Just a flick of her fingers, as if to say, "Not you. Not yet." And Serena did as asked. Quietly. Without protest. That's when the line shifted. But not in the way lines are supposed to move. It shifted in temperature. I stepped forward. Serena stayed behind. As I walked down the jet bridge, I glanced back just once and caught the image that would anchor itself in my memory, a black woman standing silently beside a gate, her boarding pass still unreturned, while other passengers, white, confident, unbothered, were waved through without a second glance. Something about it felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just wrong in that heavy, familiar way that settles behind your ribcage when you've seen this scene before, too many times. I had taught in a school in Alabama in 1968. I know what "step aside" used to mean. And I know what it still means now, even when it's dressed in customer service. I reached my seat, for C, and placed my cane in the overhead. It's more for balance than necessity now, but the crew always offers to assist anyway, their eyes flicking between the cane and my face like they're deciding how much help to give. I settled into my seat and tried to focus on my hands, dry from the cabin air, skin like parchment over bones that once held books and chalk. A few minutes later, Serena passed by. But she didn't turn left, toward the luxury seats she had paid for. She turned right. Coach. I watched her walk the aisle with the same composure she had earlier, but something was different. Her stride had slowed just a hair, as if the weight of 1,000 assumptions had suddenly been laid across her shoulders. She sat down across the aisle from me, 3 rows back, in a seat that looked too tight for someone who planned to stretch her legs in first class. I told myself not to stare. But I couldn't help it. She was so still. There was no complaint. No question. She just placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, fastened her belt, folded her hands, and stared out the window like it was all exactly what she expected. And maybe it was. Maybe that's the worst part. I felt my chest tighten. Not in fear. In recognition. I had seen this expression before. Years ago. In the eyes of a student named Monica, 12 years old, too smart for the class I was supposed to remediate, and always sitting near the back because the front row was an unspoken privilege not often granted to girls who looked like her. She never complained either. Just listened, excelled, and endured. Silence can be armor. But it can also be a wound. Minutes passed. A man sat down in the very seat Serena should have had, first class, seat 2A. Linen blazer. No tie. Champagne already in hand. Loretta, the same gate agent, greeted him warmly. She laughed at something he said. Her hand touched his shoulder as she handed him a blanket. I saw Serena glance up once, just for a second, when the curtain between cabins swayed open during final boarding. She saw him. And I saw her seeing him. But she said nothing. Just turned her head back to the window. It would have been easy to dismiss it all. I've dismissed things before. I'm not proud of that. There's a kind of weariness that grows in the bones as you age, especially for those of us raised to be polite, to not make a fuss. But something about that morning, it haunted me. I remember reaching for the in-flight magazine and pretending to read, just to avoid looking like I was staring. But my eyes weren't following the words. They were stuck on Serena's profile, how she blinked slowly, once every few seconds, like a person who's learned how to pace her reactions in public spaces. Then the crew began to close up the cabin. Loretta returned briefly to whisper something to the flight supervisor, a tall man with a badge that read, Daryl. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the glance. It was quick. Nervous. You can always tell when someone's managing optics instead of solving problems. Serena stood up. She didn't rush. She walked up toward the front, past the curtain. Calm. Professional. Intentional. She asked to speak to someone quietly. I saw the younger flight attendant flinch, then scurry off toward the galley. Something in my stomach nodded. She's going to be punished for asking, I thought. And I hated that it was my first assumption. Not because it was cynical, but because it was often true. Daryl returned. Polite. Smiling. But firm. I could see him from where I sat, explaining something to Serena with that tone I'd heard used 100 times on young women in PTA meetings, reasonable but dismissive. His hands gestured lightly. His shoulders were soft. But his mouth? Tight. I couldn't hear her response. But I saw her expression. Even from where I sat, it was unmistakable. She was listening. She was weighing his words like weights on a scale. Then she asked something. I could see her lips move deliberately. Perhaps a request for documentation. His smile flickered. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted. That's when I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. And it had been made long before she asked the question. Serena returned to her seat, but something had changed in the air. I felt it. Others did too. The man beside me shifted. A woman behind us muttered something about that lady from the front. The silence grew heavier. And I, Evelyn Rose, sat still. Said nothing. And hated myself a little for it. Because I had taught children not to look away when something wasn't right. Because I had marched once, arm in arm with women I admired, and told myself that was enough to last a lifetime. Because I had told Monica, my student, that if she ever felt unseen, she should speak up. And yet here I was. Older. Wiser, supposedly. Watching a woman be pushed out of the space she'd earned, and doing what? Tightening my seatbelt. But the story wasn't done yet. Because 10 minutes later, Serena Cole stood up again. And this time, she didn't go quietly. I'd always believed there was a kind of dignity in silence. Raised by Depression-era parents who believed in hard work and hard prayer, I was taught early that the most honorable strength was the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need to explain itself. But sitting on that plane, watching Serena Cole rise again, I wasn't sure silence was enough anymore. She moved with grace, but there was a steel tension under her composure. Not fear. No hesitation. Something more precise, more practiced, like a woman who'd been cornered before and had long since decided how to stand tall when it happened. She paused at the curtain. The same one that had separated her from what she had paid for. From what she had earned. From what she was being told, wordlessly, she didn't deserve. The younger flight attendant, a girl with dark-rimmed glasses and a nervous posture, looked up and froze. Serena gave a small, polite nod and said something quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the girl's throat bob as she swallowed hard. She nodded once, then turned and disappeared down the narrow passage toward the galley. Serena waited. Still. Straight-backed. Her hands folded at her front like a woman visiting a grave. A moment later, a man emerged, tall, polished, dressed in a charcoal vest. His name tag read Daryl. His smile was polite, his tone practiced. And from my seat, 3 rows back, I knew exactly what kind of conversation was about to happen. I had seen it in staff meetings, in school board reviews, in church committees. It was the tone of, let's keep this under control. Serena greeted him with the same courtesy she had used with the boarding agent. Calm. Measured. She explained something, I could read the posture of her body, the precision of her words. She was not pleading. She was documenting. I leaned forward ever so slightly. The passenger next to me, a middle-aged man in an oversized golf shirt, gave me a sidelong glance, but said nothing. Daryl listened. Nodded. Smiled again, this time more tightly. Then he spoke. And though I still couldn't hear, I could feel it. The tilt of his head. The placement of his hands. The way he took a half step back as he spoke. I'd seen that movie before. It meant, no, polite, but absolute. Serena tilted her head. Not much. Just enough to make her question the land firmer. She asked again, something more pointed this time. Daryl's smile shrank. He responded again. The shape of his lips told me it was a practiced line. I'd bet my cane it included the word policy. When Serena requested something, likely written confirmation, Daryl's expression changed. His weight shifted back. His mouth pressed into that sympathetic line people make when they want to appear sorry but intend to do nothing. She asked one more question. His voice grew firmer. His eyes hardened, just a little. He gestured toward her original seat, as if to suggest she return to it and allow him to handle the rest. And she did return. But not in surrender. There was something in the way she walked. Not quick, not slow. Measured. Like she had made a decision and was now walking the path to its conclusion. I exhaled through my nose, a habit I developed in my 50s when I realized sighing out loud made men think I needed help. My fingers itched. Not with pain, but with memory. When Serena sat down again, she didn't cross her arms. She didn't slump. She opened her bag. Pulled out her phone. Typed something. Deliberate. Her eyes didn't blink as she looked at the screen. Then she slipped the phone back into her purse and rested her hands lightly in her lap. She wasn't done. Minutes passed. The final boarding call was made. The flight attendants began their safety checks. I half expected things to return to normal. But nothing about the air felt normal. It had thickened. People noticed, even if they pretended not to. The man seated across from Serena bumped her leg as he shoved his briefcase beneath the seat. He mumbled an apology, automatic, not sincere. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The curtain to first class fluttered again. The man in seat 2A, the one in the linen blazer, was reclining slightly, drink in hand. His mouth moved, speaking to someone across the aisle. Loretta, the gate agent turned flight attendant, passed by him with a tray and a chuckle. She leaned slightly, offering him something with a soft laugh. Serena didn't look. But I did. And I felt it again, that ache in the center of my chest that comes not from shock, but from recognition. I'd seen this exact performance in a teacher's lounge once, when a black colleague was passed over for a promotion in favor of a younger, less qualified hire who happened to play golf with the principal. The script was the same. The smiles. The small jokes. The soft denial that anything unjust had happened. I reached into my own purse, pulled out a pen. It clicked louder than I expected. The man beside me looked again. This time I met his eye. He looked away first. I took the airline's in-flight menu card and began to write. I didn't know what. Just, something. Notes. Feelings. Fragments. Because if I didn't write it down, I would carry it home in pieces, forgetting the details but keeping the weight. Serena sat motionless, but not inactive. There was a charge to her presence, like a storm just beyond the ridge. Then she stood. Again. I felt it like a ripple. Passengers looked up, subtly. Heads turned slightly. Her movement was quiet but purposeful. She passed the curtain. Again. This time, the younger flight attendant looked alarmed. She stepped back instinctively. Serena asked, softly, clearly, to speak to the captain or flight supervisor again. Not with frustration, but with resolve. The attendant hesitated. Then obeyed. A long pause. Then Darrell returned, this time with a clipped expression. The smile was gone. He spoke more firmly now, likely repeating the same explanation. But Serena didn't back down. She said something. Short. Then removed something from her wallet. It was a card. Small. Laminated. Held with 2 fingers, like a scalpel. Darrell took it. Read it. And froze. His expression didn't crumble, it tightened. His eyes darted to Serena, then to the card, then back again. He handed it back quickly. Whispered something over his shoulder. Within seconds, Loretta appeared. Her expression drained of color. She looked at Serena, not with irritation this time, but something close to fear. The cabin quieted. Someone near me gasped. Someone else pulled out a phone. I wasn't sure what was happening. But I knew this: Serena Cole had just shifted the balance of the room. The man in seat 2A stood, grabbed his blazer, mumbled that he didn't want to be involved. He stepped aside. Serena moved forward, sat in her original seat. 2A. The one she'd been denied. And she did it without a word. She didn't need one. Her silence now was no longer submission. It was authority. And everyone felt it. Loretta stood for a moment, stunned. Then turned sharply and disappeared down the aisle. Daryl followed. The curtain fell back into place behind them. And Serena sat. Still. Tall. Unbothered. Like a queen returning to her rightful chair after letting the court make its mistake. The woman beside me whispered, "Who is she?" I didn't answer. Because somehow, I knew that was the question echoing through every row. And the answer was coming. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a disruption. It's not the natural hush of a plane settling before takeoff. No, this one is heavier. Artificial. The kind of quiet that has tension woven into it, like everyone is listening without admitting they are. That's what filled the cabin after Serena Cole reclaimed her seat. She didn't need to announce herself. Her silence was already announcing her. People stopped shifting. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Even the overhead fans seemed to hum differently. I'd felt that silence before, once in a courtroom, once in a hospital waiting room. It wasn't about fear. It was about realization. The realization that something you assumed was ordinary, just became extraordinary. The man in the golf shirt next to me leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Is she somebody?" I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if he meant to ask or if the question had simply slipped out of him. Because we were all wondering the same thing now. Serena didn't move. She sat upright, her hands resting gently on the armrests like she was conducting an orchestra of discomfort. No glare. No vindictive grin. Just poise. That's what unnerved people most. Not rage, but the absence of it. The younger flight attendant, Veronica, I think her name was, returned down the aisle. Her movements were clipped now, like she was trying not to attract attention, though of course she already had it. She offered drinks with a mechanical smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When she reached Serena's row, she paused. Just slightly. And I saw it, that flicker. That moment when she decided not to speak. She simply skipped the seat and moved on. That small act said more than any apology could have. Serena didn't react. But she saw it. I know she did. She saw everything. I pressed my fingers together, folding and unfolding them. The stiffness in my joints had nothing to do with arthritis. I'd held too many moments like this in my life, too many rooms where someone was being subtly punished for making others uncomfortable with the truth. That was the thing. It was never just the injustice that hurt. It was how the world responded when that injustice was exposed. People didn't like having to look at it. They didn't like their comfort being interrupted. Serena's presence now was a challenge to that comfort. And everyone in that cabin was reacting, some subtly, some less so. A man 2 rows ahead reached for his phone, slowly. I could see the lens tilt slightly, catching Serena in frame. He wasn't filming for documentation. He was filming for spectacle. I wanted to lean forward and say something, "Don't do that. Let her be." But I didn't. Instead, I watched Serena slowly reach into her bag and pull out a tablet. She unlocked it. Began typing. Her movements were fluid, practiced. Not frantic. Not panicked. She wasn't venting. She was building something. Recording something. And that alone gave me chills. The plane's engine hummed louder now, a signal that we were minutes from departure. But something was off. The captain hadn't spoken since his brief welcome. There was a delay. Subtle, unexplained. I've flown enough to know that unexplained delays are never just mechanical. Loretta appeared once more from the galley, this time whispering something into Veronica's ear. They both glanced toward Serena. Then toward each other. Then down. I caught it. That look. The look of people trying to control damage they didn't fully understand. They had underestimated her. And now they didn't know where the edges were. 10 more minutes passed. No movement. No explanation. Then came the chime, 2 soft tones from the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a brief delay in our departure. We appreciate your patience and will provide updates shortly. That was it. No further details. Just a sentence dressed in courtesy. But everyone knew. It wasn't about the weather. Or clearance. It was about her. Serena placed her tablet back into her bag, zipped it carefully, and sat back again. I found myself holding my breath. Not because I was anxious. But because something about this felt historic. Then, a motion to my right. A staff member, different from the flight crew, was making his way down the aisle. He wore a suit. Badge clipped to his pocket. His face was set in a neutral mask, the kind of corporate mask people are trained to wear. He stopped at Serena's row. Spoke briefly. She listened. Then she stood. And this time, the silence wasn't just tension, it was expectation. Everyone watched as she followed the man toward the front of the plane. And this time, I couldn't stay silent. I reached into my purse again. Pulled out the card I had been scribbling notes on. Turned it over. On the blank side, I wrote 6 words. I saw everything. She was right. I didn't know if I'd give it to her. Or if anyone would ever read it. But I needed it to exist. Because I had seen too many moments go unacknowledged. Too many truths vanish into cabin air. Serena and the suited man disappeared through the door to the jet bridge. The door closed softly behind them. I sat back in my seat, my hands trembling now, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something that felt like a reckoning. The flight crew scrambled quietly, but not fast enough to fool those of us who were paying attention. Something had gone wrong. And they were trying desperately to act like it hadn't. Loretta appeared again, this time with Daryl. They spoke in hushed tones, both glancing occasionally toward the front. I turned toward the window, but not to look outside. Just to breathe. To center myself. To remind myself that I wasn't imagining what I had seen. That she had been moved for no reason. That she had been denied without cause. That she had stood up calmly, righteously, and returned to her seat. And now, she had vanished from the plane. I whispered, almost to myself, they removed her, because she made them uncomfortable. The man beside me said nothing. But from 3 rows back, I heard another voice, young, female, shaking slightly. I think they made a big mistake. I turned and saw a girl, maybe in her 20s, watching the closed door of the plane. Her eyes are wide. Her phone was clutched tightly in her lap. And then I saw it, the screen was still on. She had recorded the last 2 minutes. The reclaiming of the seat. The silence. The standoff. The quiet removal. She met my eyes. I nodded once. She nodded back. Something in me steadied. We weren't alone. We had seen. And we remembered. 10 more minutes passed. Then the intercom buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't the captain. It was a different voice. A woman's. Measured. Firm. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen crew matter, this flight will be experiencing further delay. Please remain in your seats. A team will be boarding shortly. That was the message. But the meaning? It was written on the faces of the crew. Pale. Tight-lipped. Avoiding all eye contact. Then came the knock. 3 sharp taps on the plane's front door. A man opened it from inside, one of the senior flight attendants. And standing there, at the threshold, were 4 people in dark suits. 2 women. 2 men. All of them holding badges. They stepped on board, calm and professional. No weapons. No yelling. Just presence. Authority, not of aggression, but of accountability. They didn't ask questions. They gave instructions. Softly. Clearly. Without negotiation. All crew members, please disembark for immediate internal review. The announcement hit the cabin like a silent explosion. Not loud. But finally. Loretta tried to speak. Darryl raised a hand to calm her. Veronica looked like she might cry. They gathered their things. And left. One by one. And in their wake, they left a vacuum. Not just of people, but of illusion. The illusion that nothing had happened. The illusion that silence would erase it. I closed my eyes for a moment. Serena wasn't here now. But her presence had changed everything. The plane sat still on the tarmac. Passengers looked at one another, at the closed door, at their phones. I turned the note card over again, reading the words I'd written. Then, without thinking, I added one more. We remember. There's a kind of hush that comes not from calm, but from confusion. It was that kind of quiet that lingered after the crew walked off Flight 749. One by one, like shadows retreating before light, they had left. Loretta, Veronica, even Darryl. Gone. No explanations. No apologies. Just silence where authority had once stood. The cabin sat in stunned stillness. I could hear everything, the soft hum of the air vents, the faint clink of someone adjusting their watch band, the sharp exhale of a child somewhere behind me who'd been too quiet for too long. It wasn't just a delay anymore. It was a reckoning in slow motion. The seat where Serena had sat, 2A, was empty again. But it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied by something larger than presence. By a truth too heavy to ignore. Passengers whispered. Not loudly. Not recklessly. Carefully. Like they weren't sure what was safe to say yet. She was removed. Wait, what happened? Who was she? No one answered. But the questions themselves were enough to shatter the illusion that all of this was normal. From my seat, I watched the empty aisle like someone watching for aftershocks. I kept thinking, if Serena hadn't stood up, hadn't walked back through that curtain, would any of this have come to light? How many times had something like this happened, unnoticed, unrecorded, and unresolved? And worse, how many of those times had people like me been present, and said nothing? The man beside me tapped his phone nervously. The young woman a few rows back was still holding hers, the screen now dimmed, but the recording saved. I felt something begin to tighten in my chest, not fear, but memory. It came back to me without warning. A day, 38 years ago, when a janitor named Elijah at the school I taught in had been denied his promotion to facilities manager. He had more years, more qualifications, and more recommendations. But the job was quietly handed to a younger white man from another district. Elijah never said a word. And neither did I. I told myself I had no power. I was just a teacher. But the truth was, I chose comfort. Choose to remain liked. And what had that silence cost him? The memory struck deep. Uninvited. But unrelenting. And here I was, again, watching another woman pushed out of a space she had earned. But this time, something was different. Serena hadn't accepted it. She had returned. Sat down. And waited for the system to reveal itself. And when it did, when it failed, she didn't argue. She let it collapse under its weight. The cabin door opened again. But not for the crew. 2 more individuals in suits boarded, one holding a clipboard, the other a tablet. They moved briskly, scanning the space, noting the passengers. One of them made a quick call as he stood at the front of the plane. I caught a glimpse of the screen. It displayed something that looked like a back-end flight log. They weren't here to reassure us. They were here to record. Something told me this wasn't just an internal review anymore. Someone had alerted someone higher. And that meant whatever had just happened mattered far beyond this gate. I sat straighter, not from fear, but from readiness. I wasn't about to let this moment slip into vagueness. I wanted to remember everything. The way Loretta's hand trembled before she walked off. The way Veronica bit the inside of her cheek. The way Daryl's shoulders slumped as he handed off control to someone with a colder badge. The way Serena didn't flinch once, not even when she was asked to leave. She had left the plane not because she had lost, but because the rules no longer deserved her presence. That realization hit me like a whisper laced with thunder. She had not been removed. She had withdrawn. Like a queen refusing to dine in a hall that no longer knew how to treat royalty. And somehow, that made her more powerful. The intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your continued patience. A new flight crew is being assembled and will arrive shortly. Please remain seated. It was official. The old crew wasn't coming back. They had been replaced. Not rotated. Not reassigned. Removed. The weight of that choice pressed into the air around us. I looked around the cabin. Eyes met mine for the first time all morning. People who had avoided eye contact were now silently acknowledging each other. There was no small talk. Just shared presence. A quiet solidarity had begun to form, not because we'd all agreed, but because we'd all witnessed. And witnessing, truly witnessing, changes people. The man across the aisle leaned toward me. She's not just anybody, he said softly. I looked her up. I blinked. You mean the woman from 2A? He nodded. Turned his phone slightly so I could see. A headline. A picture. A name. Serena Cole, Executive Partner, Strategic Director, Major Shareholder, Helix Venture Group. And below that, Board Advisor to Skybridge Holdings, parent company of this airline. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then looked at him. She owns part of this airline, I whispered. He nodded again. And they removed her from her seat. A chill passed through me. Not because she was important. But because they didn't even bother to check. They had assumed. They had dismissed. They had been silenced. And now? Now the entire system was beginning to shake. The intercom sounded again. This time, it was the new crew. Calm voices. Rehearsed smiles. A different energy altogether. But even as they moved through the cabin, you could tell, they knew. Something had happened here. And they were not the same airline anymore. The curtain to first class remained half-drawn. That space, once closed off to Serena, was now vacant. Open. Waiting. I found myself staring at it. Not because I wanted to be there. But because I wondered how many more times that curtain had fallen between what someone paid for, and what someone was allowed. A curtain doesn't need to be thick to be powerful. It only needs to be accepted. The young woman, a few rows back, stood suddenly. Walked forward. Slipped something into seat 2A. A note? She didn't say. She returned to her seat quietly, but something about her felt taller now. And I understood. Because I had once written a note too late. This time, someone younger than me had written one right on time. Maybe the future wasn't doomed after all. The curtain had never looked thinner. As the new crew busied themselves with preparations, first class sat eerily quiet, still half-lit, half-vacant. The seat where Serena Cole had reclaimed her dignity now held only the crease of her presence. But everyone knew that space would never just be a seat again. Not to those of us who had watched her rise, return, and vanish. And not to the thousands watching from beyond the plane. It began slowly, like all tremors do. A ping. Then another. A notification buzzed on someone's wrist. A passenger gasped softly at something on her phone. Then came the whisper, "It's online." The young woman 3 rows back, the one who'd recorded Serena's final stand, had uploaded her video. No edits. No commentary. Just the truth. And the truth, once visible, doesn't ask permission to move. Within minutes, the ripple turned tidal. I watched from my seat as screens flickered across the cabin. Headlines blinked into existence like lightning bolts in the dark. Black executive removed from first class, then grounds the entire flight. Major airline faces backlash after downgrading VIP shareholder. Serena Cole incident sparks outrage and corporate inquiry. The man next to me let out a long whistle. "They're done," he muttered. "They just don't know it yet." And maybe he was right. But I wasn't thinking about them, about the airline, or the flight crew, or the investors who would soon be reaching for their emergency exit strategies. I was thinking about Serena. About her silence. Her stillness. The way she refused to shrink. And I thought, this wasn't just resistance. This was the strategy. This was leadership. I'd spent a lifetime watching men get praised for less. Around me, conversations turned. Passengers were no longer speaking in whispers. They were sharing. Unpacking. Even those who had stared blankly forward earlier now found their voices. I didn't see it until she stood back up. She looked so calm. That's what made them nervous. I didn't say anything. I should have said something. And beneath it all, a strange undercurrent of relief. As if everyone was secretly grateful that someone had finally refused to play along. I sat still, letting it wash over me. The new flight attendants moved cautiously. Professional, but aware. Their faces said, "We know we're inheriting a mess." But their eyes never lingered too long on any passenger, and especially not on seat 2A. And then, without fanfare, the captain finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure. Please take your seats and prepare for takeoff." The words were sterile. Almost indifferent. But the mood in the cabin had changed for good. Serena was no longer with us physically. But her absence had more presence than most people's entire lives. As the plane taxied down the runway, I reached into my purse and touched the edge of the note card I had written earlier. The words stared back at me. I saw everything. She was right. We remember. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't holding a note. I was holding a beginning. The ascent was slow. Maybe it always is when people know they're carrying more than luggage. But once we reached cruising altitude, the cabin returned to the muted routine of modern air travel, seatbelt clicks, tray tables, the occasional clink of a plastic cup. But underneath it all was the hum of something else. A reckoning is taking root. Someone behind me opened Twitter. I heard gasps. "She's trending #1, a voice whispered. Another person read aloud, Serena Cole, investor, diversity strategist, keynote speaker. Harvard Law. And then a third, she helped fund this airline. That was when the shift became permanent. Passengers who'd been unsure, who'd looked away when she was asked to move, now sat with the weight of knowing exactly what had happened. They hadn't just watched a black woman be pushed out of her seat. They had watched a stakeholder be erased from her investment. They had watched history be rewritten, if only for a few minutes, and nearly let it stay that way. And now they were all implicated. I turned toward the window, but not to watch the clouds. I just needed a surface that didn't ask me questions. Because inside, I had plenty already. Why hadn't I stood up? Why did I only write my note when she was gone? Why was I so practiced at regret? I remembered Serena's face, not her eyes, but her posture. That stillness. That elegance. That refusal. It reminded me of my mother the day she refused to sit in the colored section of the dentist's waiting room. She didn't argue. She just stood. Waited. And when they insisted, she walked out. Took her business elsewhere. She told me later, sometimes dignity costs money. But at least it's yours. Serena had done the same, but with more at stake. And I hadn't recognized the echo until now. Maybe history doesn't repeat. But it rhymes loud enough if you're listening. Across the aisle, a man was drafting a LinkedIn post. Behind me, someone was writing an email to the airline. A woman nearby asked the attendant for the customer service address, just in case. The plane hadn't landed, but accountability had already begun to descend. An hour into the flight, we hit smooth skies. But no one was asleep. A man a few rows ahead opened his laptop. The brightness of the screen lit up his face. I could see the words. Statement from Helix Venture Group. Reviewing all transportation-related investments. Incident on Flight 749 under formal inquiry. She had activated the very system that had tried to erase her. I felt an almost maternal pride swell in me, strange, for someone I'd never spoken to. But isn't that what justice does? It makes strangers feel like family. Because somewhere deep down, we recognize the same wound. I closed my eyes. Let my body remember what it felt like to witness something that mattered. Let myself sit in the ache of not having done more. But also, let myself hope that maybe my voice still had time left. When we finally landed in San Diego, the sun was just beginning to melt into the edge of the ocean. Golden light bathed the cabin as we taxied. No one clapped. No one rushed to stand. It was as if we all collectively understood that this wasn't the kind of journey that ended with wheels on the ground. As I gathered my bag, the young woman behind me tapped my shoulder gently. "Excuse me," she said. "Were you the one who wrote the note?" I blinked. "What note?" She smiled. "Seat 2A. I saw it when I left mine. I hesitated. Then nodded. I did. She reached into her tote and pulled out a card. Placed it in my hand. On it were 5 words, printed in tidy script. Because you remembered, I did too. I didn't cry. But I felt something soften. Something I'd kept rigid for decades. We walked off the plane slower than usual. Like people leaving a church service that had no sermon, but all the truth. At the gate, television screens were already flashing with headlines. Travelers nearby stopped, read, and whispered. Some eyes widened. Some looked away. But a few stood taller. Because they recognized her. And maybe, just maybe, they recognized themselves too. It wasn't the sound of luggage wheels that I remembered. It was the hush that fell when Serena Cole's name appeared on every screen at the terminal. The gate had the energy of a news conference, but no one was speaking. The televisions flickered with phrases like corporate civil rights breach and investor removed from her seat. No anchor needed to raise their voice. The headline said enough. I stood still just outside gate C-19, my hand gripping the handle of my carry-on, but my mind was elsewhere, still on seat 2A. On the note I'd left behind. On the young woman who had found it. On the silent thread that now bound us. People passed by, brushing close, all moving fast, toward loved ones, baggage claim, Starbucks. But I stayed. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to be there when the world changed. Or maybe I just wanted to be sure it was changing at all. I watched a little boy point at the screen and ask his mother, what happened to her? The mother didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because she wasn't sure what to say out loud. That silence, that hesitation. I knew it too well. It was the same kind that had lived in my voice for years. The crowd swelled around the television. Airport staff exchanged glances. A janitor paused his mopping to look up. Flight attendants walking past slowed just a bit when they saw the footage, Serena's calm face, her firm tone, her walk down the aisle. And still no sound. Only subtitles. It was as if the whole nation was watching her, and listening to what she hadn't needed to say. I took a seat near a window, away from the screens. I needed light, not noise. The sun had started to dip behind the terminal glass, and the golden rays hit my lap like warmth from another lifetime. I sat with it. Let it remind me that light isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just consistent. I pulled out my note card again, smoothed its creases. The words were still there, but now they felt smaller. Not because they weren't true, but because what Serena had done had already echoed far beyond them. I wasn't alone for long. A man sat down 2 chairs away. Mid-30s, pressed shirt, wedding ring. He looked over at me, hesitated, then nodded. You were on that flight, right? I nodded back. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. My sister sent me the clip. I saw you in the background. I blinked. You did? Yeah. You were holding something. A note? I glanced down at my lap. The card was still there. He smiled gently. You didn't have to say anything. That alone meant a lot. I didn't know what to say. So I said what came first. She did all the heavy lifting. He nodded slowly. And you made sure it wasn't invisible. The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because of what it said. But because of what it implied. That presence, quiet, steady, bearing witness, was no longer passive. It was part of the change. I walked slowly toward the baggage claim, where the carousel hadn't even started yet. It didn't matter. Nothing felt as urgent as it once did. There were voices now, real ones. Passengers on the phone. Reporters outside the glass. Airline staff are whispering near a printer. And then I heard it again. Serena Cole. But this time, not on TV. A woman's voice. Tired, low, but firm. I turned. A middle-aged woman in a navy uniform stood behind the customer service desk, speaking to a younger employee. She wasn't angry. Just resolve. She was on our advisory list, she said. It flagged in the system. They overrode it. The younger worker widened her eyes. Seriously? The woman nodded. They manually downgraded her. My stomach sank. It hadn't been a system glitch. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been a choice. A deliberate removal. Even knowing this, I was stunned by the coldness of it. And then something else hit me. How many other Serena Coles had been removed without a camera present? Without a tablet? Without a note? The injustice wasn't just that it happened to her. The deeper horror was that it had probably happened to others who didn't have the title, the team, the visibility to fight back. Outside, cameras had started to gather. Not a frenzy, but enough. Microphones. Press passes. Boom poles. I stood just behind the glass, watching it unfold. One reporter spoke quietly into her mic. We've confirmed the woman removed from Flight 749 is Serena Cole, a key investor in Skybridge Holdings. Her team has released a brief statement. The events today were disappointing but not surprising. We are initiating a full review of institutional bias in client-facing systems. I felt something in my chest again, not the tightness this time, but a slow unclenching. She had spoken. Not with volume. But with clarity. She wasn't calling for revenge. She was calling for a review. And the difference between those two words? Everything. The email from the airline came the next morning. I had just finished my second cup of coffee when I heard the alert. I opened the message with a breath already half held. It began, of course, with, "We apologize for any inconvenience." I rolled my eyes. Not in anger. In fatigue. The inconvenience was losing your seat. What had happened to Serena wasn't an inconvenience. It was a test. Of us. Of the system. Of who we become when no one expects us to stand up. The email continued. Words like inclusion, training, and commitment to dignity. And then a link. To submit feedback regarding your Flight 749 experience, please click here. I stared at the cursor. It blinked at me like a dare. And then I clicked. There was a box for comments. No word limit. I typed slowly. I was there. I saw what happened. And what happened was not a glitch. It was not a miscommunication. It was a decision. And the woman you removed did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply refused to shrink. And you responded by trying to erase her. You cannot train out what you will not name. This was not about a seat. This was about a system that decides who belongs. And you failed her. But you also failed yourselves. Because she was not invisible. She was unforgettable. I saw her. And now the world does too. I hit send. Then sat back. And waited. It wasn't a war. It was a quiet revolution. The kind that doesn't start with chance, but with notes left behind on empty seats. With women who write even when no one's looking. With recordings that say nothing and still speak volumes. With hands that tremble not out of fear, but out of knowing the silence has finally broken. Serena Cole had been removed from a flight. But what she had grounded was not a plane. It was the very assumption that people like her could be dismissed without consequence. And somewhere deep inside me, I felt it again. Not guilty this time. But readiness. To remember. To witness. And to speak. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first petition arrived in my inbox. I was in the garden, pruning back the dead heads on my roses, when the phone buzzed with that dry little chime that always came from my updates folder, where newsletters and auto messages lived out their quiet lives unnoticed. But this one had a subject line that stopped me. Flight 749, sign for accountability. I didn't click right away. I stood there, the garden glove still clinging to the pruning shears, heart paused in a moment I didn't fully understand. Something about the weight of those words, sign. Accountability. Felt different from the others I'd grown used to deleting. I wiped my hands, went inside, and opened the message. What stared back at me was not anger. It was precision. A clean white background. Black serif font. No colors, no emojis. Just words. On May 11th, a black executive was removed from her confirmed first-class seat without cause. We, the undersigned, believe this action reflects a deeper systemic bias that cannot be addressed through statements alone. We request an independent review, public accountability, and immediate action from Skybridge Airlines and its leadership. It wasn't fire and fury. It was a fact. And that, somehow, was more powerful. By Friday morning, it had over 180,000 signatures. By Saturday, Serena Cole had made her first, and only, public statement since the incident. I've said everything I needed to say. I said it with my stillness. The rest belongs to the systems that still think I was out of place. That line. The systems that still think I was out of place. It echoed inside me like a bell rung in a cathedral built of quiet complicity. Because I had once been part of that system. Not the kind that made decisions, but the kind that let them stand. The kind that thought silence was safety. A week passed. Then 10 days. And slowly, the response from inside the airline began to shift. At first, it was what you'd expect. An internal memo. A vague commitment to diversity training. A reshuffling of regional managers. But then the real cracks began to show. Someone leaked the internal crew report. Redacted names. But not redacted truth. It showed what we had already felt. Serena's record was flagged as VIP executive, do not downgrade. The seat change had been manual. No error code. No overbooking. And, most chilling, a note attached to her file that simply read, verify if appropriate. Those 3 words hit me harder than I expected. Verify if appropriate. Appropriate to whom? By what standard? And how many others have been quietly deemed inappropriate without ever knowing? The media picked it up. The public ran with it. News anchors who had once referred to Serena as a passenger involved in a seating dispute now used phrases like corporate profiling, systemic gatekeeping, and investor disenfranchisement. Late-night hosts made sharp jokes. Talk radio split along predictable lines. But underneath the noise, something else was rising. Memory. Collective memory. People began writing in. Black professionals shared similar stories, Downgrades, delays, extra screening, softer exclusions so subtle they could never prove them. A woman wrote. They told me there were no seats left in business class. Then I watched them upgrade a man beside me 5 minutes later. A pilot anonymously confessed. We've all seen it. The seat changes. The glance. The decision. It's not always policy. Sometimes it's just power. And me? I did something I'd never done before. I wrote an op-ed. Not for a major paper. Not for a blog. Just for my church bulletin. But it was the first time I ever put my silence on paper. I was there. I saw her walk back into first class. I saw her claim what was hers. And I saw what happened next. I've been alive long enough to know that change doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it stands still. And sometimes, standing still makes the rest of us move. The next Sunday, 3 people stopped me in the fellowship hall. One of them, Carol, who's led music ministry since before disco ended, had tears in her eyes. I didn't know you were on that plane, she whispered. I didn't know I had anything to say about it, I replied. But now I did. And the words didn't want to leave me anymore. 2 weeks after landing, something extraordinary happened. Serena Cole came back. Not to the airline. To the public. But not to speak. To build. She launched something called the Aisle Project, a nonprofit initiative aimed at documenting travel bias and advocating for industry reform. The logo was simple, a single airplane aisle, empty, stretching toward an open cabin door. No names. No slogans. Just the image. But it said everything. The aisle where she stood. The aisle where she returned. The aisle that had divided us until one woman decided to cross it twice. And here's the part one didn't expect. One afternoon, as I was sorting mail in my kitchen, a letter arrived. Handwritten. Elegant. No return address. Inside, a note card. The same kind I'd used on the flight. On it, just 7 words. Thank you for writing it down. S. No signature. But I didn't need one. Her stillness had spoken. But now she was listening. I placed the card in a frame beside my desk. Not to boast. But to remember. To remind myself that not all stories get headlines. Some sit beside you on a flight. Some whisper through the walls of waiting rooms. Some live quietly inside your silence, until the day you permit them to speak. And when they do, they don't just fill the air. They change its pressure. They say people forget the details of injustice, but they remember how it made them feel. It had been nearly a month since Flight 749, and yet every time I sat down on a bench, at a pew, in my favorite kitchen chair, I thought of Serena Cole's seat. Not because of where it was on the plane. Not because of what happened in it. But because of what it came to mean. It had become something larger than the airline, larger than policy, even larger than Serena. It became a mirror. And when people looked at it, they saw themselves. The first time I spoke publicly was at a senior center. It wasn't a protest or a rally. Just a Tuesday afternoon lecture series called Tales from the Window Seat. They'd invited me to speak because someone had heard I had a good story about air travel. I brought nothing but my words. I didn't need notes. I just told them what I saw. What I didn't say. What I wrote. And what happened after. There was no thunder in the room. No ovation. Just silence, the kind that listens. The kind that holds something sacred. And after I finished, an older gentleman in the front row raised his hand. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice gruff but genuine. I didn't have a neat answer. But I told him the truth. We remember. And when the next Serena appears, not as a headline, but right beside us, we don't stay seated. Not long after, a letter came. From a young woman named Haley, who had been on the same flight, 2 rows behind me. She'd written an article in her college paper about the incident, and included a short paragraph about an older woman who quietly left a note in first class. That was me. And that was enough. She said that seeing me write that message gave her the courage to upload the video. She'd hesitated, afraid of backlash, afraid of being told she was making it worse. But when she saw me scribbling with that shaky hand, so calm, so steady, it reminded her that there was more than one kind of strength. "You didn't shout," she wrote. "But you showed me how to say, I was there. I saw it. And it matters." I began to hear from others. Not many. Just enough. A retired teacher in Ohio. A Vietnam veteran in Sacramento. A grandmother in New Jersey who'd never been on a plane in her life. They all said the same thing. I didn't know it was okay to speak. I thought silence was safer. I thought dignity meant being quiet. And I understood. Because I had once believed the same. But now, I knew better. Dignity isn't silence. It's the decision to keep your voice intact, even when others try to write over it. The Aisle Project continued to grow. No press conferences. No splashy campaigns. Just stories. People submitted letters, photos, and memories. Someone built a digital wall called the Cabin Archive, a place where everyday travelers could share moments when they'd been made to feel like they didn't belong. One of the first entries read, "I wasn't removed. Just stared at it like I was. I was 13. Another. They told my father to step aside for random screening. We missed our flight. He never flew again." And then one that stopped me cold. "I saw a woman stand up once. Reclaim her seat. She didn't yell. She just returned. And when they tried to make her leave again, something shifted. The whole plane seemed to hold its breath. I didn't know who she was. I do now." It had begun. The memory was alive. And it was moving. One morning, I woke to find Serena Cole's name trending again. But this time, it wasn't for what was taken. It was for what she gave. She had declined a board seat at another airline. Instead, she funded a fellowship. A program for first-generation college students to study ethical leadership in corporate systems. It was called The Quiet Return. I wept when I read that name. Because I knew exactly what it meant. Months passed. The noise faded. But the lesson stayed. I traveled less. Stayed home more. But when I did go places, I walked a little slower down aisles. Watched a little longer at the boarding gates. And sometimes, I wrote notes. Not long ones. Just words that needed to exist in the world. I slipped one into the tray table pocket of 4C once. Respect doesn't board last. Another into the seatback magazine. You belong. Especially if someone makes you feel like you don't. And I left one inside the bathroom mirror frame at the gate in Savannah. You are seen. Even when they pretend not to. I never signed them. But I like to think someone, somewhere, unfolded one, just when they needed it. Maybe memory doesn't just live in stories. Maybe it lives in scraps of paper, tucked into places where silence used to live. The last time I saw Serena was not in person. It was on a screen. She was speaking, not at a rally, but at a symposium on infrastructure and accessibility. Still poised. Still grounded. Still hers. She wore a pin on her lapel. Not a logo. Not a slogan. Just a seat number, 2A. And I knew then, she had claimed that seat forever. Not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been told they were sitting in the wrong place. She smiled once near the end of her talk. And said something I'll never forget. I didn't ground that plane. I grounded an illusion. And sometimes, illusions need to land before we can rise. I shut the laptop slowly. And looked out the window. The afternoon light poured across the kitchen tiles like the sun remembering how to be soft. I thought of Monica, my student from decades ago. Of Elijah, the janitor. Of Haley. Of Serena. Of the girl I used to be, the one who held her tongue so tightly she forgot what her voice sounded like. And I thought, maybe this is how change happens. Not in revolutions. But in reversals. One person returning to a seat they were never supposed to leave. One note slipped into a tray. One witness who decides to remember. I reached for my notepad. Tore off a fresh sheet. And wrote just one line. Let no seat be claimed by fear again. I folded it. Tucked it into my purse. And smiled. Some stories don't end. They just board it again. In a world moving faster than memory, Flight 749 reminds us that dignity is not loud, it's steady. Serena Cole didn't reclaim her seat with anger. She did it with presence. And in doing so, she reminded us that sometimes the most powerful act is refusing to be erased. For those of us who have lived long enough to see injustice in all its forms, this story isn't new. But its impact is. Because, for once, the silence didn't win. A woman stood up, sat back down, and shifted an entire system. The message is clear, what you witness matters. What you remember matters even more. And whether you're 35 or 85, your voice still carries weight, especially when used to say, I saw that. And it wasn't right. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you reflect, remember, or simply feel, please like, share, and leave us a comment. Tell us where you were when you first realized your voice could change something. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss more stories like this, because remembering, together, might just be the most powerful thing we do.